And today I'm going to talk about stamping techniques and different inks. The first thing I'm going to talk about are going to be your stamps. There's several different kinds, so let's go over theirs. The first ones are wood-mounted stamps. That's a rubber stamp with a cushion with sticky-on back that's mounted to a wood block. These are really nice because they have colored images on the front usually, so you know what your image should be colored like. But the drawback to them is you can't see where you're stamping when you're placing your image down. The next stamp that's out there is what's called an easy mount. It's a rubber stamp that has a cushioned easy mount backing on it. It's a slick backing that adheres very nicely to the acrylic blocks. The next stamp that's out there are unmounted rubber. Unmounted rubber stamps are gray, purple, or red, and they usually have no backing, no sticky at all. So what I have done is I've taken and gotten an acrylic block, placed strips of reusable double-sided sticky tape on it, and then I just mount my stamped image on, or my image to stamp on there, and away I go. And last but not least, we have the acrylic images. Acrylics are really nice because they usually come with more than one image on the block or on the stamps that you buy. They usually have sentiments with it, so you get a little bit more for your buck. They adhere nicely to the acrylic blocks, and the nice thing is when you want to place them somewhere in a different spot, you can see where you're placing them to stamp. A note about the acrylic stamps and the easy mount stamps. Do not use either of these stamps on the double stick tapes because the double stick tape will ruin the backs of these stamps and they will not adhere correctly. With are going to be the dye-based ink pads. Dye-based ink pads are a permanent ink pad. They say waterproof, but my experience with most of them have been they are not. They're really good for glossy papers, cardstocks, non-porous papers. They are not good for metal, wood, glass. They don't seem to adhere well to that. They are excellent for fine detail, and here is a sample of a fine detail that I've stamped onto a ATC card. The next set of dye-based inks we're going to talk about today are the variegated inks, or the inks that have multiple ink paddings. These are, again, dye-based. Again, they're good for watercolor paper, glossy stock, cardstock. Most people use a brayer with these. And I've done an image today that I've brayered with a resist technique. This is a piece of glossy stock with Queen Anne's lace stamped in resist and then brayered over the top. A note on these pads, do not store these upside down to keep the inks fresh. If you do, it will make the inks run together and you'll ruin your variegated ink pads. The next inks I want to talk about are going to be another dye-based ink, but it's the Memento pad. This one I have found is waterproof and resistant, and it's an excellent ink to use when you're coloring with Copic markers. The reason being, other ink pads can cause Copic markers to bleed. For example, this one was used and colored in with archival ink. This is the Rangel archival ink pad, and I colored it in with a Copic marker. And as you can see, it's bled really bad into the image and gotten fuzzy. It's bled onto the Copic marker, which will ruin the marker. Whereas the Memento ink does not have that problem. And again, Memento can be used on watercolor paper. It can be used on regular cardstock. It can also be used on glossy stock, but I would heat set it when you do that. Permanent ink pads are solvent-based ink pads. One that's real familiar to most folks is the StazOn that has the black ink. They come in many colors. They come in red, blue, green, yellow. I was really surprised at the different colors that they came in. With the StazOn ink pads, these are really good for fine details too. The finer the detail of the stamp, the better these are, and the same with the archival ink. We're going to talk about both of these together since they're both a permanent type ink. These can be used on metal, wood, glass, acrylic, paper, watercolor paper, gloss stock. They're long-lasting and permanent. They're fast-drying with really good colors. They're a resilient dye, and they're suitable for watercoloring. They're also suitable to paint over. There's a wide variety of surfaces that you can use these on, but just be warned, they're like a Sharpie marker, so you kind of need to be in a well-ventilated room when you're using these. This, again, is the fine detail that you can get from the StazOn ink. This is a piece of metal that I've stamped with StazOn with a butterfly image that I have, and it's just a block butterfly. It has no real fine detail to it, and it's permanent and stays on there fine, hence the name StazOn. Now, with archival ink can do something kind of funny. It can do a reverse resist. And so what I've done here is I have taken a piece of acrylic and gone around and put alcohol ink on it. Then I took that same butterfly stamp that I just showed you, which is this one here, and I inked it up with the archival ink, and I placed it on top of the area that I alcohol inked. Then I took a rag and I very gently rubbed the alcohol ink off, or the archival ink off while it was wet, and it did a reverse resist. Pigment inks are a very thick, viscous type ink. They do not dry well, so the great thing about these inks are they're good for embossing, because they stay wet long enough for you to get your embossing powder on there so it doesn't blow off. Again, like I said, they do take a while to dry, even with heat settings sometimes, and they can do things like smear. This was stamped yesterday, and as you can tell, it's still continuing to smear. So it's really best that you use embossing powders on these, or let them sit for quite a while before you use them, or before you put them in their sleeves. With the embossing pads, they're not felt like your die pads. They're actually a spongy pad, and they also come in many, many colors, and they're refillable. They are color fast, and they're not as opaque. They're not see-through. But again, it just depends on what application you're using this on. And then with these inks, pigment inks are usually best only on cardstock. Embossing ink. An embossing ink is just a plain, clear ink pad, and it helps embossing powder stick well. So if you want to emboss something but you don't want to have color like using the pigment inks, then you can use this pad, and it's perfect. A note on embossing inks and on distress inks and resist inks, also on StazOn inks and archival inks. Once you use your stamps with these, clean them immediately. These will dry out your acrylic stamps and your rubber stamps and make them crumble and fall apart. So you always want to make sure that you clean just as fast as you can when you get done using these products. The next product I'm going to talk about is the Versamark Watermark Stamp Pad. You can stamp your images onto, just get a plain colored piece of paper, and you want to make a watermark or make a darker image on the paper. Well, that is what this is good for. It makes wonderful backgrounds. The next ink that I'm going to talk about, and it's great for embossing too. The next one I'm going to talk about is Resist. Resist, again, is a clear ink, just like the embossing and the watermark. Again, you'll want to make sure that you clean your stamps immediately when you use this product. But again, I've taken a piece of gloss stock, and I have stamped my images onto it, the Queen Anne's lace. I took and brayered over the product again with one of the variegated pads. And once I got done, I stamped over the top of the image with StazOn, just to put some fancy little words on there. And the Resist can be used on paper and gloss stock. The same goes with the embossing and the Versamark. If you use it on anything that's acrylic or metal, unless you're embossing on it, it's probably not going to work as a resist and stay there.